Hi, everyone. My name is Carlton Butts. I am CEO of Roundfire Inc., one of the event partners. I'd first like to thank everyone for attending our Executive Conversations for Change series today. Your attendance says a lot about you, that diversity, equity, and inclusion, commonly known as DEI, is important enough to you and your organization to spend 90 minutes with us today. We hope we can make it the best 90 minutes of your week. Before I get started, I would like to acknowledge Kevin DeBray and Louis Wharton, partners at the law firm of Stubbs, Alderton, and Markleese LLP, as well as John Bela Merced, an associate at the firm, for making this event come to light. They have worked tirelessly to ensure this event will help each and every one of you in some way to advance DEI within your organization. I'd also like to thank Seth and his team over at the Horowitz Agency for helping us spread the word about this event. We will be talking about race, which is a sensitive topic for many people. But if you're here, you already know this event deals with DEI issues, so please keep an open mind. The goal is to have an honest, even if uncomfortable discussion about these topics, because it's the only way we'll move forward. The catalyst for our Executive Conversations for Change series stems from an open letter I had written to CEOs about DEI. Given everything that happened last year involving racial injustice, I felt that I had to get my thoughts on paper. I shared the letter with Kevin, a longtime friend, who strongly felt we needed to take action. So this event is a culmination of me, Kevin, Louis, and John working together over the last few months to bring you a lively and informative discussion on how you can build a strong and sustainable DEI culture within your organization. But the DEI discussion does not end here. This is our second DEI event, and we are committed to doing more in the future. We hope that you will continue to join us. We'd also like to hear from you. We provided a link to our survey in the Q&A section for your feedback on this event. Your input is valuable and helps us produce events that are most useful to you and your organization. Each of us has a journey that brought us here today. And along that journey, we all have experienced many things that influence the way we see the world. Through this lens, we mold our objectivity and our bias, which ultimately reflects on how we see and interact with others. These unique experiences offer unique perspectives that can enhance business performance and improve a company's bottom line. The data backs this up. According to a PricewaterhouseCoopers report, 85% of the CEOs they polled whose organizations have a diversity and inclusiveness strategy say that it has enhanced business performance, and 56% say it has helped them compete in new industries or geographies. McKinsey & Company has also focused on this area. They analyzed data from over 1,000 companies in 15 countries and found that a more diverse company are likely to outperform their less diverse peers on profitability. In fact, executive teams with the highest ethnical diversity were 36% more likely to financially outperform teams with the least ethnical diversity. That percentage is 25% for gender diversity. As a business leader, you have the power to build a culture that fully embraces diversity, equity, and inclusion. To build a strong and sustainable DEI culture, you need to be willing to change yourself and empower those around you to change as well for the betterment of your organization. You also need to be willing to make the tough decisions, when necessary, to ensure your company's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion is upheld. This commitment needs to be part of your organization's DNA, so it will continue to thrive even when you are no longer with the organization. You also need to be an active participant in building and maintaining your company's DEI culture, and not just delegate this responsibility to human resources or to someone on your management team. The greatest assets of any organization are its people. Use DEI to make your company better, stronger, and well-positioned for the journey ahead. We've assembled a very talented panel today to help you navigate this journey. I'd like to introduce our moderator for this event, Nicole Yeldell Butts. Nicole is an accomplished DEI executive, strategist, coach, facilitator, and a highly sought-after public speaker. She has served as a chief diversity officer, a director of employee diversity, inclusion, and climate, director of equal employment, manager of affirmative action, and an executive consultant. During her 20-year career, she has built 3 inaugural DEI offices within institutions and coached, trained, and counseled senior leadership on diversity, equity, and inclusion matters. We are happy and honored to have her with us today. Nicole will now introduce our distinguished guest panelists.
Thank you very much, Carlton, for that introduction. And I welcome our panelists, Denise Benuelos and Allison Reedy Williamson. Please allow me a moment to introduce them, and then we'll jump right into our questions. So Denise Benuelos currently serves as the Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity and Workforce Development Director for Kaiser Permanente, Washington. She has over 25 years of experience leading and implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies and programs in both not-for-profit and the private sector, where she has established a track record of transforming companies' culture as a collaborative change agent. She specializes in gender transition in the workplace and is credited for achieving the Healthcare Equity Index as a leader in LGBTQA for City of Hope by the Human Rights Campaign. And she has also received the Diversity First Award, a prestigious recognition by the National Diversity Council. So Denise, thank you for joining us this evening. And then I'll introduce Allison Reedy Williamson. Allison is a global diversity and strategy executive whose career spans entertainment, politics, and not-for-profit, with a focus on inclusion, strategic communications, and stakeholder engagement. Her expertise or her experience includes being Senior Vice President of Public Affairs and Corporate Responsibility for MTV Networks and Viacom, where she helped build the Office of Global Inclusion, increasing the company's visibility in diverse communities and aiding diversity recruitment efforts. She currently serves as Chief Inclusion Officer at Endeavor, where she has increased Endeavor's diversity footprint as a thought leader in this space. Allison has been recognized with a commendation from the City of New York for women's leadership, induction into the YWCA Academy of Women Leaders, and a Woman of Influence Award from Essence Magazine. Our panel discussion today will last approximately 80 minutes. We'll spend about 50 minutes on planned discussion with our panelists, and then 30 minutes to open it up for Q&A from you in attendance. So please be sure to drop any questions that you have directly into the chat feature. So with that, I'd like to start our discussion. So our panel today focuses on building a diverse, equitable, and inclusive culture. So Allison, Denise, how do you define diversity, equity, and inclusion? What are we talking about when we say DEI?
I'll take a stab first.
Denise.
When you're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, there are three distinct areas. They're not all one thing that some people kind of pull together. When you're talking about diversity, it's inclusion of individuals that are representing more than one race, national origin, color, age, religion, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, and so forth. So your protected characteristics as an example of your diversity. Diversity of thought, where you're from, where you are, where you grew up is your diversity. Equity is fair and just treatment. So there's a difference between equity and equality, but equity is the opportunity and access and exposure to resources for all without exception. And then inclusion is full engagement of every employee's diversity background, experiences, and perspectives. So you can have diversity and not have inclusion. And so it does require you to plan for it and be intentional when it comes to inclusion specifically.
And I don't have a thing to add to that. That is, Denise laid it out perfectly. And the addition that is not part of the question, but I think is important because it speaks to language and how we engage in the discussion around DEI, is because of the definition that Denise just provided around diversity, there's not a diverse candidate, right? There is a diverse slate candidate.
Yes.
One person is not a diverse entity. necessarily. And so that's just one of the things that we often are caught up with, like when we're looking at candidates or employees, et cetera, or programs. Like we all have we're part of that diversity, whoever we are, if we're together and we're creating these opportunities for a range of voices, ideas, and thoughts.
Allison, thank you for saying that. I think it's really important because you're right. We often hear people say, well, we need diverse candidates, but it's really that diverse slate because we're all unique. We're all diverse. And there was a word you used, I think is really important here. And it ties back to what Denise said. And you said together, right? So together we create our diversity, which is part of, I think, what Denise, you were sharing about the inclusion piece.
Yes, it's relational. So, and that's the way it should be looked at. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what are some of the components then? We now know what diversity is versus inclusion versus equity. As Denise said very aptly, these are different things. They're not the same thing. So talk a little bit about the components of creating a diverse workforce. And then we can talk about inclusive workforce and equitable workforce. Allison, any thoughts on components of that?
Sure. Well, so first, I think part of, especially in the workplace, one of the things that we are constantly aware of is how we all get to show up. And we know that there are different ways that people have agency within an organization, within a workplace. And looking at the equity and opportunity and access that everyone has to thrive. We don't want anyone to thrive above anyone else. We want there to be an equitable access to everyone being able to grow and build their careers wherever they're sitting. And so one of the things that I would say as a component of diversity, equity, and inclusion certainly is understanding first, like, how are we all doing, right? How are the people within an organization or a workplace feeling that they can show up? Because it's very difficult for people who don't feel that they have agency or that they understand their path to make space for others. And so it creates a much more challenging path to bring people together, to expand the diversity efforts around who comes in through the door, and certainly to create spaces for inclusion. If I don't know why I'm not being invited to the meeting, I'm not quite sure I can explain, or I can make space and encourage or support somebody else being invited to that meeting.
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent point. And I think that what you're saying and what I'm hearing and how I feel from just hearing you say that is respect. It comes down to just creating a culture of inclusiveness that's rooted in respect. And employees must feel like they're treated in that way through whether it's civility and decency in the way that they're spoken to, the tone that's used, what leaders will allow other employees to interact and engage or behave toward another employee, all speaks to that civility and decency. And so that's one component that's very important, is inclusiveness around and respect. One other thing is just valuing employee strengths rather than, setting them up to fail and giving them an assignment that they're not strong to, but, lead with the strengths. And one of the things that we do at KP, for example, is we use Clifton Strengths to create a culture of inclusion. And we try to get the leaders to follow with their team to take an assessment of their Clifton strengths, and that they lead with their strengths and they identify and know what their employees' strengths are and make sure that the assignments are aligned so that they are thriving through their strengths rather than being given something that's not something that they do well at. And that's one way that leaders can be intentional in creating an environment where employees feel like they can safely express themselves. If they have someone that's taking time in developing them, they have someone that's respecting them, and they're giving them the opportunity to thrive. I think those are some additional components that create that EID culture.
When Carlton opened for us, he mentioned that these are executives on the line, people with the ability to have an impact and make a decision. So with that in mind, and also wanting to make sure that they walk away with something tangible that they can use. So with that in mind, what are some things that you identify that executives can do to try and create that inclusive environment? Oftentimes it rolls down to HR, as Carlton said, right? But as an executive, what are some things that they can do specifically to create this inclusive environment that you're talking about? And Allison, you used the word agency to make sure that everyone in the organization has agency.
Well, first, I think I start with education, education, education. I think we are, particularly in the C-suite, it's often difficult to acknowledge what we don't know. And this is an area where it's okay. It's okay to keep learning. I learn every day. And I think one of the things that is really important, particularly because of the way that executives are managed, right? That often they're unable to understand and see what reality is for the rest of the employees, or even what sometimes something that is as simple as saying, one of the examples that I'll give is, I have an open door policy. Anyone can walk through my door. Well, there are people who absolutely will walk through that door, but there are others who will never feel that they are empowered to walk through that door for a range of reasons. And so doing a litmus, like doing a test, pulse check on how are people able to show up, allow that to be an opportunity where people anonymously can share how are they experiencing, what is their experience in the culture? Because we often feel, and this happens when you're an executive in a company, that you understand what's happening, but it's a different lived experience because of where you sit. And so giving an opportunity for employees to provide some feedback about what is happening. And in many cases, people will say, I love my manager. I think my manager does treat me with respect and I feel heard and seen. And then others might just say, I have no idea how my work fits into anything else that's happening in this company. And so it allows for, or I don't feel like I have access to leadership, whatever it might be, but it's just it's a good practice to get data, right? To see how people are feeling about how they can show up. And I think that's step one, because from then you have information and then you can make decisions around that.
Good point. And especially the example about the open door, because you're right, many of us say that, but people don't actually take advantage of that. And that is very impactful for people's ability to truly have agency. Thank you for the permission to continue to learn in this area and the acknowledgement that you're learning every day. I'm learning every day. Denise is probably learning every day. We have to be open to that ongoing learning in order to really create the organizations that we want. Before I move on, I do want to stay on the word agency for a moment, because one of the things I've noticed in talking with executives over the years is that, and with individuals who aren't executives, there's a sense that me allowing you to have agency somehow takes away from my agency, that there's only but so much agency to go around. Can you all speak to that idea?
Well, it's my favorite analogy, especially when we're talking about access and equity. It's not a pie. There are not finite slices, right? It's like if I get 2 pieces, that doesn't minimize like how many pieces of pie you can have. And I think that's exactly what you're referring to, Nicole, which is that there is, when there's opportunity for everyone, there's thriving. And it allows for there's less toxicity frequently, and there's also more opportunity, like engagement in trying to bring in innovation and trying new things, because there's not an insecurity about what that means for how I show up compared to somebody else. So when you have the ability to ensure that not just a finite set of people have the ability or the agency or feel empowered to make mistakes, right? Like that in and of itself is part of the process of equity and inclusion.
I thought I saw you about to say something. Was there something you wanted to share with that as well?
Well, that kind of reminds me of that Clifton Strengths thought process. you know, where you're playing to the strength so that you don't set the employee up for failure and build them that way. Because you're right, and if they don't do well, that you don't beat them up for it because they won't step back up again.
Yeah, excellent point. Excellent point.
Yeah.
So you,
Sorry, I was just
Go
going
ahead.
to, and sorry, Nicole, I was just going to say too, because part of what I hear frequently and I've heard over the course of my career is the unwritten rules of the road, right? And that goes hand in hand with having agency, right? Like you don't know where the missteps are going to happen because no one has really hipped you to, well, you know, we use Keynote, we don't use PowerPoint. Like, how did they come into this meeting using the wrong presentation platform? Or they're all, I mean, very, like, it goes from very small issues that actually do resonate bizarrely in corporate America to the larger issues that can be obviously really damaging to someone's career and their career path. And so even like creating that like visibility of what it takes to have to be promoted, what it takes to be a strong performer in whatever level or whatever department you're in, like having clarity around expectations, like all of that actually helps people feel confident that they are getting that they are doing the right thing and therefore are performing well for the company. It's when you're feeling like, I actually don't understand if I'm, you know, I'm getting mixed messages, I'm not getting feedback, I'm being told they love me, but yet I'm not getting promoted. All of the different things that happen when there's not that transparency and set of expectations of, you know, to go hand in hand with Denise, what you were saying about knowing strengths. It's also like knowing what the steps are to move forward or to be considered a high performer.
so I'm hearing transparency around expectations. And that's really important because oftentimes we don't provide that clarity and that transparency around those expectations. So people can thrive best when they know what the expectations are and they're not trying to figure them out as they go. Excellent point, thank you. So you've established what diversity, equity, and inclusion is, and you've established that they're different. But I want to ask another question in this realm because I find oftentimes that individuals, particularly executives, think that diversity means we have inclusion. So can you all speak to having one and not having the other? Can you have diversity and not inclusion? Can you have inclusion and not have equity? Denise, I see you shaking your head. Yeah.
Absolutely, especially if you don't have the right foundation. I mean, inclusion is not a natural consequence of having a diverse team. And so if you don't have any understanding around how to build inclusive policies and practices and equitable, which would be even different, then it is going to be a mess. And so you have to create or design for inclusion, for example, before we get to equity. So, for example, when you are putting policies together that you consider the various religions in your workforce that may need prayer rooms, gender neutral restrooms, or some type of accommodation for the generational needs, whether they are transitioning, how they want to be identified, how they're identified on their badge, their email, their tagline, or any other way that they want to present themselves without having policies that hinder that. So the more open you are to the variety of the diversity that one brings to the workforce, is being able to accommodate. And that's one indicator that an employee feels that they are included and can bring their whole self to work. When it comes to equity, it's meeting their specific needs. So in healthcare, we might treat a patient differently because of their race, because of how they respond to medicine, whatever those needs are because of their culture. There would be a difference we wouldn't want the same. We want to make sure that they are getting what they need in order to have the best outcome, health outcome. And so our policies have to be designed in a way that also be very equitable in the way that we spend time with them if necessary. It's not a one-stop shop when it comes to the medical field, when you're feeling that void for equity. And it's an ongoing learning process. You don't get it right the first time. And it's probably the more toughest one to get right out of the three components of DEI or EID, however you identify it.
And I think, when you're talking about the bring your whole self to work, one of the things that I've seen across, many years is that there's an excitement for diversity, right? I've not ever worked with an entity, a company, nonprofit, anyone who said I don't want diversity. What happens though, is as soon as we get people who are underrepresented and coming into a company there's a majority, there's a push, even if it's unintentional, for assimilation.
Yeah.
And part of what that piece that, you were speaking to, Denise, too, is the inclusion and equity, is that all of a sudden we're excited about these people are bringing these different experiences, lived experience, the viewpoints, and they may look different as well. And they come in and we're saying, okay, now this is the way we do things. And so part of what the opportunity and why I actually love this work is that we actually get to work with leaders to embrace and understand what's now possible because you have these people here, because you've diversified, because you have this opportunity for innovative thinking. You have this expanded landscape and environment where you now can think differently about what kind of products you can develop and who might be interested in them and how might they be used. And so it seems often like work or a task to have to diversify, when in fact, what it does is it makes you it strengthens. And I think Carlton referred to this the McKinsey report. It strengthens your capacity. It increases your revenue stream. There are all these opportunities that come, as long as we're not saying, welcome everyone with all these different perspectives and different experiences, now do this.
Yeah.
Right now, be like this. And so that's something that we all have to just be vigilant about when we're saying we want diversity and inclusion and equity.
Excellent point. Excellent point. So let's get specific then. Now that we kind of know what we're talking about, how do we create it? So if you do not, let's say you have diversity, because I agree with you, Allison. I've not encountered an organization yet who has said, we don't want diversity. They like the idea of diversity, but then they get diversity and they don't know what to do with it, right? So how do we create this inclusive and equitable environment? First question around that is, who needs to be involved in the conversation? Who needs to be at the table when we're talking about how do we create this?
Well, sorry, Denise, did you want to
No, go ahead.
take it? Well, I would say obviously it starts from the very top. It starts from the CEO and the president. It even is, frankly, at the board level. Is, because we have to recognize what may be required in order to do this right. And what that means sometimes is shaking up the executive team meeting, right? Who's in this conversation? Who are we hearing from? Who's presenting? It may mean we need to think about differently about when we have these meetings, because it may actually create some challenges for certain people depending on what they're experiencing and living right now in this crazy day and age, right? With different types of work structures or office structures. So there's starting from the top. And it also means, while there's so many companies that are struggling to get back online after a very, very challenging year, that they may feel well, you know what, we're going to put this to the side. We're going to put this diversity stuff to the side. We just need to get the business back. And within the executive, the senior leadership teams, there has to be a conversation, discussion, and recognition of actually the way this business comes back is by continuing to have this conversation and moving forward and understanding all the opportunity. So in the room, it starts very much at the very, very top. And it's not to just to take away from any of the organic and the employee organizations, the resource groups, et cetera, who can really help inform. Because in fact, those voices in those rooms are important. So having an opportunity for those to come in will really help expand, again, how people understand, how the leaders understand what's not only, what should be happening, but what's also possible.
Great. So I'm hearing you say the board, if there is one. I'm hearing you say the executive team. And I'm also hearing input from those ERGs, for instance, those employee resource groups. So those are three entities. Denise, you were going to add?
Yeah, well, if you have a council, a DEI council members would be good. Yeah, you need somebody at the top, you need the middle managers, because that's the biggest challenge in this space, is getting the middle manager to grow, to accept and and follow through on some of these initiatives that they feel like it's taken away time from their productivity. So we need their support. They are the most critical piece, is those middle managers understanding how it can, at the end of the day, help them achieve their goals, because they're seeing it typically as a one-off, as a nice thing to do, as opposed to a necessary thing to do in order to advance the company's initiatives. And then you can't forget your DEI champions, because they're spread out throughout the organization at various levels, some of them at the highest level, some of them are at the lowest levels, but they're the ones with the passion. They're the ones with the desire to, and seeing things that no one else is seeing, that they need to have at the table to say, hey, did you know we don't have this, that, and the other? And this is what can come out of that by us doing this. So, and they may be at a level that no one would consider them to have at the table. So they're leaving out potential good ideas that spring forward, initiatives that spring forward profit. So we don't want to discount anybody at any level, but these are key strategic people who typically have the passion, desire, and ideas, or they have the level of role to influence and motivate those who are not on board. So all of them are needed, absolutely.
And I heard you say some of those champions may be able to say to you, hey, did you know we don't have this? The other thing I think they can often say is, hey, do you know how this impacts me? Or do you know how this impacts this other individual or this group? So we get an idea about the actual impact that it's having on folks. Who else needs to be at the table? It's interesting because I didn't hear you mention HR, which is fine. I just say that because oftentimes that's what I hear executives say first, right? HR. And I think they need to be at the table, but it's interesting that you all who do this work didn't say them first. So who else needs to be at the table? Talk to me a little bit about the people we serve, or the people the organization serves. Do they have a role in this conversation?
At some point, maybe not in the early parts. It depends on where they are and the phase that they are with their program. I'm not certain that that an external organization is good to be influential too soon in the process, but at some point they're going to look for who needs our help, and that's where they come in.
I agree. I think if we were talking about a social service organization or entity, that might be I might have a different response and have that engagement earlier. But I think the internal buy-in is critical. And Denise actually called out that, that what we often refer to as the frozen middle, right? It is a very important body. And so again, one of the things that is important for the leaders, people who are on the call, who can make the decision is and help create the culture where the middle management is feeling like they actually can slow down to make decisions and have a diverse slate of candidates for a role that they're hiring for, or that they are allowed to have the space to take the time to even expand their own network by taking lunches with people who aren't right now business critical, but could be in the future. And so that message does have to come through, not just the edict. The role modeling of this behavior is very, very important, because as we say to many people in our lives, pay attention to what they do, not what they say.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And I would include the DEI leader.
Assuming you have one, or you need to get one. So what are some specific steps that they should take? What are some early steps that need to be taken? Allison, you mentioned earlier data. So what are some steps?
Well, first, so a pulse check,
Okay.
understanding, like recognizing what are people willing to be held accountable for.
Ah, great
And
question.
we all have, companies have goals. We all have KPIs. Like what are and where does the DEI, like where is that reflected in the accountability and the performance indicators? So are we being measured against how we do? And then if we are, what are those things that we're being held accountable for? Because it shouldn't be like go out and hire a bunch of Peloponnesians, right? It's actually how do we hire, like what are we doing to create a culture where everyone can thrive and we have space and make space for a range of voices. And so that is, they're just, I often will list out that can be chosen from a roster of, here's what I'm willing to be held accountable for. I will commit to having a meeting or a lunch or a coffee or breakfast with someone from the junior ranks of the company. Or I might be, I'm willing to be a diversity champion for an internal group. Or I would like to go out and sit on a board and learn more about communities that might impact my constituency or that are part of my constituency. So there's a range of activity, but really are opportunities. But role modeling what it is that you want to see happen with your direct reports and their direct reports, but writing it down and saying and doing a checklist. And it's your own checklist. It shouldn't be diversity, shouldn't be HR. It should be, here's what I'm willing to do. This is what I want to be held accountable to.
There's also, you can take so many different approaches. So data is the best source to go to, whether that's your People Pulse results, scores, or where they're going to be indicators from the questions that tell you where there's a lack of inclusion or lack of stability or a lack of advancement. It's depending on your questions and who you vendor with, but that's a great source. Looking at your current demographics, as Allison stated, that will tell you where you're underutilized and can do better. And then also, another approach, if you didn't have data, you weren't tracking this information as closely as you would have hoped or wished to be able to use the data to guide you, is to, if you identify you want to do training, you want to do hiring, you need community involvement, you need supplier diversity. You could create a array of this is something that you said, Allison, that triggered something that one of my former employers did, is they picked 5 areas where they could improve diversity with no data. You just know you could improve diversity in your approaches when you're hiring and so forth. And the HR business partner worked with each top business unit leader to say, which one of these 5 do you think will be closely applicable to what your plans are or what your initiatives are for the following year? Are you planning to do a lot of hiring? Is there turnover happening? Are you going to be doing some community work? Maybe focus on something that you can do to contribute toward the community efforts, or you're going to be doing a lot of purchasing. If you're a marketing group or HR group, you might want to focus on making sure you use a diverse supplier instead of go around that. So they had to select from the 5 what goal was going to be their focus. So that's one thing that as another approach in the way that you could, after starting the conversation, depending on whether you have data or not, that you could start building from that.
Denise, you mentioned supplier diversity, and that prompts me to want to ask the question, again, trying to give people some very concrete steps and areas on which to focus. Mm-hmm. I'm hoping you two can help me kind of name some areas that people may be able to think about focusing on, right? Allison, you mentioned hiring, so we know that's one. Retention, we do a lot of work around hiring, but we don't do nearly as much around retaining people. Promotion, how do people promote through an organization and get access to better positions? Salary equity, compensation equity is another area. Supplier diversity, Denise, you mentioned. Community engagement. So those are 6 right there. What are some other things I'm missing that we need to be thinking about when we think about diversity and equity and inclusion?
Well, I think Denise just mentioned the training.
Training.
The opportunities for the conversations. So we all know, I'm sure that given our experiences, that one and done is not what we're about when we're talking about bias awareness training or like understanding anti-racism or all of the different work that I'm sure we've all been involved with. It is there, but there is value to, having said that, there's value to laying a foundation for us to all understand what we mean when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like, what is that? What should that mean to us as a business, as individuals? And then from there, how do we build on those conversations and those workshops? So having a series of workshops and opportunities for people to engage, which, by the way, could be one of those other areas that people hold themselves accountable. Like, I will, much like a credit, right, that we do for like to refresh our degrees. And so in our certifications, what are some of the workshops that people could have access to in order to ensure that they're continuing to grow and deepen their understanding of microaggressions, of opportunities that are just in like implicit bias, of all the different ways that, or just good managing diverse teams. This is in how we are, just all of us are constantly challenged and struggling with lexicon and in like language and terms and phrases and that we all were raised with. And only when we're pushing through and having expanded experiences do we recognize, wow, like it's actually crazy that I ever like said that, right? About, or asked if there's someone who asked like, oh, well, they're going on maternity leave, are they coming back? Right? Like, not appropriate. Right. But but it's all in part of our, like, and it's part of this sort of narrative about women who become mothers. Right. And so one of the things that we really need to do is figure out like how to create spaces for those conversations and to work out some of the opportunity, like to have opportunities to grow and become more confident in talking about underrepresented people, talking about equity and inclusion and diversity in the workplace. People who don't do it often will stumble, and and then the more they stumble, will not want to do it, right? Not want to talk about it. So we want to build that comfort level and the knowledge behind it so that more people can have agency and even having conversations about how we all get to show up.
Yeah, that is interesting because it sounds easy for people who are engaged in these conversations on a regular basis. But give me 2 things an executive can do to start or allow these difficult conversations to take place. How do executives support these culture conversations?
We're doing that actually right now. So it's kind of interesting you asked that. When we launched our, it's called Belong at KP, which is basically your dismantling racism and bias and unconscious bias. And so one of the things that we had asked our leaders to do was to facilitate a debrief of the training that they're required to take. And things came out in the early stages of this training that, whoa, I don't feel equipped to do this. Just like Allison said, that as soon as it got a little uncomfortable, I'm out, right? And so we decided to take a step back and hold off on completely executing the training until we provided training for the leaders on how to facilitate that conversation. And use a model where we allow the space for the employee to talk, because they've given us feedback. They want to be able to talk about these difficult conversations. So when it happens, you don't want to shut down. You want to give them the opportunity to bring their concerns forward. If it gets heated, you acknowledge what the person is saying. You acknowledge their pain, how they're feeling about what they're saying, and then try to get to a space where the team can come to some agreements to be able to operate in a way that's respectful for everyone, to feel like they can be there without judgment um, um, or be subjected to microaggressions or so forth, because that's where it gets kind of uncomfortable, is the employee, calls out someone's behavior. That's, people get defensive, they get defensive if they feel like they're being called a racist, and don't really respond in a civil way. And the leader is left holding the bag with, how do I do this? I don't know what I'm doing. And it's just addressing that, letting the people have that platform, talk about that, and then get to a point where they find a resolution. If it's something that they can't handle in a conversation, then they can always bring in DEI leader or someone from the team, a consultant, HRB business partner, to be present to help with when it goes south. But they shouldn't shy away from this conversation. I think that it's important to know the pulse of the employees. And when you give them an opportunity to tell you what's going on, that's how you have the opportunity to fix it and move forward. Because otherwise, you're going to face turnover, and you're not going to know why. You're just going to walk out the door and not tell you it's because you didn't manage it, hold people accountable to being civil and respectful and so forth.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's exactly right, in the notion of having, like, the hardest, it's extremely difficult to get feedback that you've done something that feels so antithetical to who you are. And the initial, no one wants to be in that position. It's not a good feeling. And so getting comfortable in hearing feedback and also processing that it may actually not all be you, but as a leader, you have a responsibility to ensure that people can feel heard, and you respond in an appropriate fashion. And it's not easy. I'm saying, and that's some of the work, and those are the conversations in the workshops. And because there's I don't like it, but I also, equally difficult is giving someone more senior feedback. And it may not seem that way. And by the time someone does give feedback, it's because it's not the first time. And so that's the other piece to understand. And so the work and the steps that Denise was just describing, absolutely those are critical steps, because if the conversation ends in a shutdown or the exchange, then, and like, you know what, we've talked about this enough, or I'm not a racist, done. Right? Of course you're not a racist. No one thinks you're, but it's where it goes. And it gets to, at least in sort of our little, the committee in our head that is really defensive.
Yeah.
So that piece of work is super critical, because it informs how others feel they can respond and can give feedback, and also not. And in addition to that piece, I would just throw in the comment that often, one might hear in this time where, like, you can't say anything anymore, right? Like, I don't know what to say. I don't want to say the wrong thing, right? Which is real. And you can't say anything anymore. And those are two very different things, because one is one doesn't want to offend. One doesn't want to get off track. We want to be heard in the way that we have something we want to share, and we want it to be heard in a certain way. There's also language we have to learn and unlearn. And we're all doing it. And so the more opportunities we give people to understand and recognize why that's important will help us become more fluent, and again, able to engage in a way that people feel heard, and people are also leading.
Right.
Excellent points. So I'm hearing a continued encouragement to get educated, to continue to grow, to seek out people who can support you and teach you maybe how to have those conversations. Denise, like you said, executives may not automatically know how to have those conversations, but they have to have them. So they need to be accountable for getting whatever support they need to learn how to have those conversations. Is that part of what I'm hearing you all say? Yeah. So what's one of the greatest barriers that you all have encountered to actually creating DEI in organizations?
Accountability.
Accountability, talk more about that.
Just getting DEI goals on their, having the executives or even all leaders have DEI goals is a great start, because if they don't have stake in the game, then they won't assess. It should not be a one-off department responsible for all of the DEI work that goes on that's going to benefit the entire company. This is something that everybody has to have some kind of role in order for it to be successful. Have an understanding where their role, where their position plays that role in contributing to meeting major initiatives. And the best way to do that is to have that as a goal for our leadership. At a minimum, have a goal for the leadership team. But before you even get to the point of the goal, the other barrier is the CEO buy-in. If they don't understand the benefit of having a diversity inclusion program, then it's really, trying to manage it from the bottom up is only going to go so far, and you're going to get stuck at the frozen middle, as Allison stated, and you're going to just constantly feel like you're pushing up against a wall to do something that you feel is in the benefit of the company. So has to start at the top, and they have to have buy-in. So that's a barrier in some cases, is really getting the effective buy-in, because it's not one thing to say, it's not enough to say, I want a program. You have to say it, you have to commit to it, you have to model it, so that people know that you're serious about it. You require your leaders to have goals around it to meet key initiatives. Then we're talking, then the barriers come down. But those are the ones that stop a program in its place from being truly successful, from my personal experience in this business.
So it's not enough for an executive to say, if this is important for the organization, it should be organic. Let people develop it. Let our ERGs tell us what we need to be doing. It's not enough for it to be grassroots. It has to start at the top.
Yeah.
Allison.
And I agree with all of that. And another barrier or another challenge would be hard days. When things get hard, when there's a turn on Wall Street, when there's a global pandemic, when there's a need for, there's some other crisis, everything, it often, unless it's embedded and built in the way that Denise was just describing, it falls off the page. It's the budgets get reduced. When people are, it's hard to make space when you think you're fighting for your department. All of a sudden, all of the intention gets put to the side because there's a big challenge afoot. And the more it becomes ingrained and embedded and built in, the more difficult it is for it to be shoved aside to turn to the business at hand, right? It's always in the business at hand if it's done well. So the biggest barrier, and one of the biggest challenges is, wait a minute, we just, dropped this many points on NASDAQ. Like, all right, we've got to scuttle over here. And all of a sudden, a lot of the work goes gets sidelined. And so it's that's an additional barrier. I totally agree with everything that Denise also outlined.
I know in the previous executive conversations for change, there was a comment made that diversity, equity, and inclusion is not the 10th thing on your plate. It is the way you do the other 9. And I think that's what I hear you saying, Allison, when you say it has to be embedded, it has to be ingrained.
Yeah.
Denise, you mentioned goals. One of the things that I think has been a disadvantage for DEI over the last several decades is that we haven't done a good job of measuring it. We haven't done a good job of defining the benefits. when we think about putting together initiatives or strategies within our organizations, we always do that with a way to measure how we know they're successful. And I think DEI has to be another one of those. When we start putting together our plans, our initiatives, our strategies, whatever we're going to do, we have to identify from the very beginning, how is this going to be measured? And how are we going to hold people accountable to it? And that's something that I think as a whole in this particular space, we have not been as intentional about doing. So I would encourage executives to make sure that as they're building out their strategies, whatever they may be, that they do that from the very beginning with the way in which they're going to measure the success of those initiatives and those strategies. So what are some pitfalls to avoid? We talked about some barriers. What are some pitfalls that you've seen that you want to caution our executives about?
I would say getting caught up in program and initiatives and forgetting that this is a way of being. I've worked with some of the most innovative companies across my career. And in many cases, all of these that are like inventing ways of living on virtually and online, like creating just different experiences that one could never have thought of. And then when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, it's like it's 1973. It's incredible. Like they pull something out, they dust it off and okay, right, diversity council, okay. And so part of what the pitfall often is that's, it's considered done. We have, and there's nothing wrong, obviously, with diversity councils or task forces or employee resource groups. In fact, they're very important when they're empowered and they've got structure and they have purpose and they're recognized as such. It is absolutely essential. And the pitfall is thinking that's it. And if that's where we end and start and end, then we're not going to be able to talk about measurement. And that's part of the challenge. So I would give our preceding chief diversity officers a little bit of grace, because I don't know that there was actually permission to do much more than that and be able to measure and to be accountable. Because I think in many cases, if there was a measurement taken, it wouldn't have been so good. So I think we're in a different time now. I think we have some extraordinary people in this work and extraordinary partners and leaders in companies who are really willing to lean in and avoid some of those pitfalls. But I think a quintessential pitfall that I would call out is thinking that the program or initiative is what diversity, equity, inclusion is.
Agreed. Absolutely. Thank you. Denise, any thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree. One, it starts at the top, but it also is laying out an action plan is important, and that everybody is clear on what steps that the organization is going to be taking to make this change, especially if this is a pitfall of starting an EID program. And then, everyone should be using a common language when they're and how they define it, so that it should start with defining everything where everyone's using the common language. So we found that to be a challenge at Kaiser, where they have a speak up culture, but depending on who you interview or talk to, they have a different understanding of what that means, and they talk about it from different levels of their perspective of what speak up means. Some people think speak up culture is being able to bring a complaint forward. Some people, the intention of the program is to speak up when you see someone make an error so that we don't kill anybody, that they feel comfortable to be able to do that and be able to make the change. But that's the main thing, is for safety purposes. But speak up has taken on a life of its own, and been reused for different things. So making sure you have a common language and understanding of what you are, if it's a program, what that program means, and be effective in being clear about it to everybody at every level. And then also just making sure that you have clear steps on how you're going to be effective with that program.
I'm going to ask one more question, but before I do that, I'd like to encourage the audience to please send in your questions. So the chat box is open. There's also Q&A. So if you can use either one of those to send us questions for the panelists, then we'll start taking those in just a moment. My last question is really not a question as much as it is as an invitation. Denise, I know we were talking before about some of the work that's been happening at KP and the way in which your executive leadership has brought you in and your team into the creation of a new building.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's a perfect example of how this work has to be embedded and ingrained in everything that we do, and it's not a standalone.
Right. So one thing is that our president, Susan Mullaney, is, she is a disciple of Bernard Shaw. So that she not only gets it, but she's also is supportive of our initiatives and our programs that are being developed. And so he had shared with me, I would like for you to embed EID in everything that we do. And so this apparently has also been communicated and shared with her direct reports, who do involve me. They call me for a variety of different things outside of your typical scope of, we need help with hiring or whatever. And so KP Washington is in the process of building several new hubs in various cities that are in very diverse cities. And so the planning team has invited me to be part of that planning team before concrete is even poured. I am part of the plan on what supplier we choose, how we hire, who we engage for the staff that will be to support this hub, from how the bathrooms are situated. So I've made sure, we obviously have ADA rules that will make sure those are in place, but people may not be thinking about gender neutral restrooms and the importance of that and showing inclusion. It's on tribal land. So most of Washington is on tribal land. And so it's important that they acknowledge that tribe in some way. It can be honored through a plaque, it can be honored through naming the building in some way after it, but just making sure that that is acknowledged as well. So I am there to think of things that they may not necessarily think of when they have a community discussion. Are we pulling in our community partners? So I'm there to just say the what ifs. So are we doing this? Are we doing that? With all of the other players that are at the table that may not be thinking about it from an equity lens.
That's great, because it also then allows the people who you're at the table with to start thinking about things more broadly. So the next time when you may not be at the table, they have seen what that thinking, you've modeled it. So they start to understand some of the questions they need to be thinking about, some things they need to be thinking about as well. So that's great. Allison, any examples of extraordinary leadership in this area that you've seen?
Well, I think, I would just add, first of all, I think that's great. And I think it's so important because one of the things that, Endeavor has really taken seriously and took very seriously is the going deep and looking at where are there opportunities and reviewing to do better and to strengthen their commitment and demonstrate their commitment, and taking that lens of looking at their policies and practices, policies that may have inadvertently have just the gendered language that's riddled throughout almost everything that I've read 1,000 times over the years, and only as I again pay closer and closer attention and recognize how it permeates everything, right? And looking at that, and so there are some real opportunities that and I've been also able to join planning sessions and conversations both about how we return to the office. I led how we return to the office because it's an equitable, and it's certainly about equity and inclusion. right? And what comes on the other side of that, and what that means for so many of our employees having a range of experiences in this last 18 months. And so there's certainly, and 20 months. And so there's certainly, you know, I can't actually say enough about how I feel about, in the most positive way, what both like our president and CEOs were committed to doing in order to ensure that we both demonstrated a commitment to deepening our education and understanding and the leadership level, and also just showing by doing throughout in the way that we organize very, very critical pieces of work that impact our employees and our constituents.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have a couple questions. I will start with the very first one. Let's see. It's a question around allyship, which I thought was an excellent question. No, you did not miss it. Can you talk a little bit about the role of allyship and your experiences of how it has worked well and also not so well?
Well, I'll jump in. We had a wonderful conversation that our Chief Human Resources Officer, Carrie Chandler, who is an incredible leader and partner in this work, and we co-hosted back in June of 2020, and Van Jones was one of the speakers and part of the panel. And what he talked about was there are allies and then there are co-conspirators, right? And what's the difference between the two? And both of them are valuable, right? And it's important to note what it means to be an ally. And we actually are, we're leading conversations for every company, for every employee across the globe, to have access to what it means to be an ally. And this also goes back to a bit of our conversation around how do we speak and how do we show up for others, and who gets to show up and who has that agency to speak their truth and also to speak on behalf of, and how that manifests itself. I think that, I've at this point seen only positive impact, because people are so ready to recognize where they haven't been an ally and how they want to course correct and learn different skills, right? But I can see how it could go left in certain places. I haven't seen that in our company yet, but I will, I'll be very transparent when it does, because I think it's because people are trying. So I won't begrudge them. We'll make mistakes. People will make mistakes.
That's an excellent point. I heard two really important things. One, course correct, but also it is a skill, right? Allyship is a skill that we have to learn, and it's okay if we're making mistakes early on. We're trying, right? So I like that you said it's okay if they make a mistake. At least I know they're out there and they're leaning into it, and we can work through that. Thank you. Denise, any thoughts on allyship?
Yeah, it's also important for, we were able to get, we're currently training on bystander training because of the violence against our Asian employees and our community. And so we, Holla Back is the company that has been putting on this training, and it has a lot of similarities in terms of allyship. And so it instructs very much how to be an ally, in understanding that you're not an ally by being sympathetic to the group that you're an ally to. You're an ally the minute you speak up on their behalf, whether they're in the room or not. And that's something important. A lot of people say I'm an ally, and they're not willing to use their, like Allison said, use their agency to be able to change that behavior with that individual. So there were a lot of lessons learned from that bystander training that could be very easily applied to allyship and understanding. That's when it begins, is when you step up and speak up. Yeah.
Stepping up and speaking up on behalf of. Thank you.
Yeah.
Should organizations proactively promote internal mentorship programs to increase equity and inclusion?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Say more.
Focusing on that right now, we have a goal that's specific in engaging our business resource group leaders through a mentoring program. And so there's an informal program where we require 6 months, that they work with their mentor for at least 6 months, because they found that you need at least that much time to build trust and be able to gain some traction. And the only thing they do before they're off on their way is go through a Clifton Strengths assessment. So they're at least knowing how to work with each other, knowing each other's strengths. At our national level, they have something more formal. It's called Mentor in a Box. And again, it targets diverse groups. And it is more formal, where they have guest speakers, and it has a beginning and an end. So, but I think it makes a difference having a mentor. That mentor can potentially turn into a sponsor once they know what your skill sets are. That having that mentor might build up some of your where you're not strong enough to speak for yourself, where you're weak on to, in order to get that visibility. You need to be able to get yourself in room. That mentor might be able to either help you how to get yourself in the right room, or speak up about you in the right room. So I think mentorship does play a critical role for building a diverse workforce and engagement, and it can also be the key to retention. So it can check a lot of boxes just having that one program in place, but build it strong enough that people actually take it seriously and stand up to be a mentor, or be willing to be mentored. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I agree. I think a strong mentoring program is definitely key to a retention strategy. We have, and so I agree. I think there are a range of ways of this manifesting, of a mentoring relationship manifesting themselves. And part of what I have found, just again, and the different places that I've had the opportunity to lean in in this work, is that many people don't know how to be mentored, and they don't necessarily know what it means to be a mentee. And part of what we are working on, and not because they're not bright, smart, great people, it's that what the expectation is not always clear. And we often, particularly people of color or underrepresented people, don't know how to reach out in the way, or be like, or take advantage of an offering in a way that makes themselves slightly vulnerable. Because we don't have the necessarily always the permission to be as vulnerable as some of our colleagues.
Or vocal.
Right. And so I think, so one of the things that we've run a couple of sessions on is, even what are some of the ways that we organize our personal board of directors, right? And who, like, do we have peer colleagues and confidants, we've got mentors, and we have sponsors, and we have people both inside and outside the company. And where we as a company help organize is really provide both guidance on how to be all of those things. Because I think you can be a mentor and be a junior person in the company, right? We can learn from everyone. And you can also, and being a sponsor is not necessarily in the way that we organize and think about it, is not necessarily someone who's going to know the nitty gritty of your business, but will certainly be thinking about you and probably just see the best of you, right? They're not hearing about the challenge you're having with your colleague, or what you're trying to figure out about another job search, or et cetera. They're sitting in a room that you're not going to be in. And they're saying, you know what? Nicole would be really great to put on this project. I understand she's been doing this and doing that. We need to put her over there. Like, it would be really a wonderful thing to consider. They don't necessarily know all of the other intricacies of what's happening in the day-to-day, but that's okay. So there are different ways and how that's engaged by the employee, by the Nicole in this scenario. Those are all really important. Those are also other skills to develop, because they're not organic to everyone. And so we do need to have some training, as it sounds like, Denise, you lead or have, and as well as opportunities to think about the different, like the menu of options and opportunities to have advocates in the workplace.
Yep.
Great, thank you. Another question, this is a great question. How should we think about our customers when designing and implementing or revising DEI?
We are our customers, right? Like, so I think our employees are a microcosm of the world. And so the understanding sort of how a lot of the, whether it's in the United States, what was, the racial reckoning that was occurring last June, the impact of COVID and just, a horrible narrative on the AAPI community. These are people who we work with as well. And these are also our customers and our clients and and so a lot of the work that we build is we're engaging the employees who are also, reflective of the people we serve and the people we want to be serving and who we want to be working here. So there are elements where we'll reach out to, certain clients to see if there's anything in particular that can be insights, et cetera. Some of our conversations that we might have regarding representation will bring in our clients or prospective clients. But the reason that we're having the conversation is because we're in our company speaking to the range of employees and their lived experiences and realizing we've got to pay attention to this. So that's all I would be able to add to that, answer that question.
For us, we have to think about what our patients tell us or our members tell us. And so they are looking for Black mental health workers. They're looking for a Black doctor. They're looking for somebody who can speak their language. And so that becomes our focus in how we help them find bilingual caregivers to support the language. In some Washington, Spanish is big, or Russian is big, or Mandarin is big. And so we know we're based on their request for interpreter services, what we need to hire more and target more for those specific locations. And we need to start looking at pipelines for internships for Black doctors because there's a shortage everywhere. And so they're specifically looking for it, and they get very frustrated if we're not able to accommodate if they are requesting for that. So we're looking at that. I mean, that drives what our targets are to what our members are telling us. So eventually, yes, the community, your customers do drive your ship, and direction you go in. And those are the things you need to be thinking about is, just as Allison stated, the reflection of your community and who you support, who you service. Mm-hmm.
So we have a question around difficult conversations. Are written policies or statements the best way to establish safe spaces to encourage difficult conversations, or should executives lead by example?
I don't think a policy is going to create it. It's really, it's great to have, but so many people don't even know we have certain other policies. So that's not going to do it, especially if you don't communicate it or share it. But it is about modeling. It's about it's about modeling appropriate behavior and setting up the environment for them to feel comfortable to speak up without, retribution. That's the biggest fear of most employees is there going to be some type of retaliation for me being honest and coming forward with catching an error, or, I'm going to need this nurse to work with me next week. I'm not going to reveal that they almost killed this patient. Who knows? I'm just, making it up. I'm not saying that straight, but I'm just saying that retribution can be real in the head. Yes. In terms of what they say. And so in order for an employee to feel safe to come forward, they would have to have a policy, or not a policy, but have a practice of making them feel that it's okay to do that.
I totally agree. And I think that when you are able to have more of those conversations, when those conversations are being observed, witnessed, and seen, what's a difficult conversation is redefined. So the more comfortable, right, one becomes and more common we're talking about race, like, I think even now there's a little bit of a different reaction when we're saying we're naming race, when it's often only seen as, well, you're naming race because you're not talking about whiteness, right? And now there are people who I love it, because I think there are white leaders who are saying like, well, as a white woman, I'm thinking about whatever, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. It's not something that actually is often said, and was certainly not said before. And so shaking a little bit of the, oh my gosh, she just said she's Black thing out of the mix, and being able to having that be more, people be more comfortable with. And I'm using race here just because I'm thinking about how Carlton started the conversation. I think that's what shifts what becomes more difficult. So it might be, if you're talking about sexual orientation, having a conversation about gender pronouns, right? Like there might be another conversation about, a number of other things. The more we become comfortable and fluent in how this is discussed, or even in how we respond to it, the difficulty minimizes, or maybe there's something else that becomes more difficult, but some of these other things that we're thinking about become less so.
Excellent point. Thank you. What resources would you suggest for practical steps to implement or improve DEI initiatives, programs, strategies? Resources, practical steps, which is similar to the last question I was going to ask of you as well. If you were starting this tomorrow, what would be the first thing you would do? What step would you take? What resources would you be looking towards?
Well, the three biggies, Diversity Inc., SHRM, and Diversity Best Practices are your best friends, because they're going to keep you up to date on the latest and guide you through the pitfalls, or give you a best practice example of something that you can actually easily implement right away. So
those resources were Diversity Inc., SHRM,
and which is Society of Human Resources, and Diversity Best Practices.
Allison, thoughts?
Yeah, well, I first say that's really concrete. That's good. Giving it's like resources to go to. Yeah. I go back to, and this actually that speaks to the resources that Denise just mentioned, is I go back to the education. Like if I started today, it would be like understanding where we are and what is it that we're hoping to see, right? Yeah. What does success look like, and understand that. So we have a vision of what we're heading towards. What do we want when we're thinking about even how our company shows up and who's showing up to our company? And it's an exercise that then can allow for, okay, well, so what does that mean? We need to make sure we have some really great people here. We need to make sure they stay. And what gets in the way of them not staying, or what makes it so they don't stay? And so looking at, having a pulse check, understanding, like doing a survey, understanding, like being clear about like who's in the conversation. So that goes to an earlier question that you asked, or, a prompt, which was, who's having this conversation? Is it just happening over here in the diversity group, over here in HR? Or is it part of a leadership strategy to grow the business and think about like how we stay innovative? So as concrete as, that would be, step 1, step 2, and the step 3 are not even necessarily in this order, but certainly recognizing or understanding what we're even talking about when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Having a common language and bringing everyone into it, so everyone feels a part of it and everyone understands their role in it and how it helps them. Everyone wants to know what it takes to be to get their promotion. Everyone wants to know what are some of the ways that they connect, what are the rules of the road. Everyone wants to understand what their contribution means to the company. And that's something that, and to ensure that everyone has that is significant. And so that may not always fall into the bucket of inclusion, but that's absolutely an inclusive practice. So that's, those are the top three. But I'm really excited because I think SHRM is an incredible resource. I think DBP, Diversity Best Practices, is really fantastic. And Diversity Inc. I think is good as well in the metrics area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you just answered one of the last questions we have, but I'm going to put it out there anyway, just in case there's anything else you want to speak to about it. And it is around the success. Yeah, I'm curious of some of the key baseline characteristics that should be considered when you're thinking about measuring success. That's our question. What are some baselines when you're thinking about measuring success?
I look at I very rarely look at who's coming in the door. It's important. I look at who has even tried to come in the door.
Yeah.
I look at who's tried to come
and who has been asked to come in the door and has said, no, thank you.
Uh-huh. And what that experience, right, exactly, in that experience. I certainly look at who's leaving, who's not staying. Yeah. That'll tell your story right away. And, I think a lot of companies talked about it last year when they saw, 2 million women leave the workforce in the United States? 2 million. I look at, and this is all data, I look at progression data. I look at how people are growing and who's growing in the business, in the company, and where. And then, I look at overall, because the important piece of this is there are onesies and twosies depending on what business department, and looking at it as a pattern as opposed to dots to see whether or not we have a problem. So, but that's how in success. But those are the metrics. If you're looking at talking about the data, that's the data that I look at. Oh, I'm sorry. Along with that is compensation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Denise, any other thoughts?
Said it all. Yeah.
So before we close, I'm going to ask one final question. And you may have addressed it to some extent, but just one sentence. You've been in this field for a very long time, both of you. You've worked with lots of executives. What is one thing you wish all executives knew about DEI?
It's not a program.
It's not a program. Allison, I think you've been saying that all along. What?
Not a program. Absolutely, I totally agree. And my sentence would be, it is our business.
Mm-hmm.
It is our business. It is the business. Without it.
Yeah. Yeah, potential choosing. I choose who as a consumer, I choose who I do business with based on who they hire, what I know about them in the news. All of that sways whether I continue to do business with you or not.
Absolutely.
In my decision.
I look at, look at in the medical profession, I certainly look at the roster of physicians in a practice.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
These are things, and the next generation, actually, probably 2 generations from me, that's all they're talking about.
Uh-huh.
They're looking at, where do I see myself? If I don't see myself, or I don't see any, if I'm not seeing it might not even be a reflection of me specifically, but if I don't see an innovative mindset,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
this isn't for me.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both so much. So executives, you have your final thoughts. It's not a program, it is what we do. And you've had lots of information too around how to measure this and what kinds of things you need to be looking at and thinking about. So Allison, Denise, thank you so much for your time this evening. Very appreciative that you took the time to have this conversation with us. To our audience, thank you very much for joining us for the last 90 minutes. Carlton mentioned a survey, so I think that has been dropped into the chat. Sure enough, it has. So please take a moment to complete that survey. It will inform us as to how we can offer another executive conversation for change in an effective way. Keep your eyes open for the next executive conversations for change. So thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Good night.
Bye.